Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're looking past, the sort of sci-fi headlines about bringing back woolly mammoths. We want to focus on a much more fundamental question.
Yeah, if we can actually bring an extinct species back, does that truly help conservation?
Exactly. It moves us way beyond just the cool factor of the technology.
Right. And for this, we're diving into a really key paper, De-Extinction and Evolution. The lead author is Alexandre Robert.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that most debates around de-extinction, they're often philosophical, or maybe they focus on the cloning tech itself.
Sure, the ethics and the how-to.
Precisely. But this paper, it really shifts the conversation.
Yeah.
It takes established evolutionary science, the stuff we use every day in conservation, and applies that framework to de-extinction projects.
Okay, so they're using the existing rule book, the evolutionary conservation framework that justifies, saving endangered species today,
Exactly that.
and seeing if de-extinction actually fits, if it holds up under that same scrutiny. So what's the mission here? What are they trying to figure out?
Well, it's really twofold. First, can a population we resurrect actually survive long-term? Can it function in the ecosystem, local success?
Right, can it just live where we put it?
And second, even if it does manage to survive locally, does that actually represent a benefit to biodiversity on a bigger sort of global macroevolutionary scale?
Are we genuinely restoring lost evolutionary history, or is it, like you said, just creating something interesting but maybe not truly valuable in that deep evolutionary sense?
That's the core question. What does success really mean from an evolutionary biology perspective?
Okay, so let's get into the immediate problems they raise. Because, like you said, this isn't just reintroducing an animal that wandered off. It's trying to recreate it.
Yeah, and Robert and the team highlight some major constraints that really set de-extinction apart from, say, standard reintroductions.
What's the first big one?
The first major hurdle in the short term is what they call the discontinuity of biological processes.
Discontinuity.
Okay. Yeah. Basically, the methods we'd use cloning, maybe advanced genetic editing, they completely break the chain of passing down essential information from parent to offspring that isn't purely genetic.
Right, so you get the DNA sequence, the blueprint,
Yeah.
but you lose all the other stuff.
You lose, well, kind of the operating system that runs on that blueprint. Even if the genes are spot on, the organism might lack the proper epigenetic makeup.
Those are the chemical tags that tell genes when to switch on or off,
Oh.
right? Influenced by the parent's environment.
Exactly. And you lose vertically transmitted symbionts, think gut bacteria, other microbes essential for digestion or immunity, that the baby normally gets directly from the mother.
So a clone could look healthy at birth, but then it might struggle because it doesn't have the right internal toolkit, microbial or otherwise. Or maybe it misses out on things like maternal antibodies from milk.
That's the risk. This discontinuity can lead to serious developmental problems, higher death rates after birth, even if the genetics seem perfect.
And that's before we even get to behavior.
Right. We haven't even touched on losing cultural transmission. How does it learn where to migrate, how to avoid predators, which foods are safe? That's all learned, passed down generation to generation. Cloning breaks that chain completely.
Okay, so the non-genetic inheritance is a huge issue. But let's talk genetics, because that's often pitched as the strong suit of de-extinction. What about the evolutionary resilience of these new populations?
Well, that's where you hit the bottleneck problem straight away.
Yeah.
The paper stresses that low evolutionary resilience is almost unavoidable,
Why is that?
because the initial genetic diversity you manage to create is often totally disconnected from the actual number of animals you release.
Meaning, you could release, say, 100 mammoths, but if they all come from the DNA of just one or two salvaged individuals...
Then you haven't released a viable population. You've essentially released a large family of, well, highly related individuals, potentially clones or near clones.
Genetically speaking, a very small starting point.
Extremely small. This drastically limits the starting genetic variation. It creates a severe bottleneck effect right from the get-go.
Which leads to problems like inbreeding.
Inbreeding, genetic drift having a much bigger negative impact, reduced overall fitness. And crucially, it really limits the population's ability to adapt down the line to new diseases, to climate change, whatever the future throws at it. They start off evolutionarily compromised.
So if the aim really is restoring evolutionary history, you'd need far more genetic diversity than just cloning one or two samples allowed.
Oh, absolutely. The paper points out that even if you used advanced genomic editing to try and capture historical variation, you'd likely need genetic input from hundreds of different individuals, maybe even using DNA from closely related living species as a scaffold just to build one population that's robust enough to avoid these issues.
Wow, that really highlights the difference between just making an animal versus making a functioning, evolving population.
It's a massive difference in scale and complexity.
Okay, so the short-term biological hurdles are significant, but the paper argues the problems get even bigger when you consider the timescale involved. This brings us to section 2, the problem of time and the mismatch with today's world.
Yeah, this divergence issue is, I think, maybe the most profound challenge. It's linked to what the paper calls evolutionary freezing.
Evolutionary freezing.
Think about it. When we do a standard reintroduction, maybe bringing wolves back to an area they vanished from, the time gap is usually, what, decades? Maybe a century or two at most?
Right, relatively short in evolutionary terms.
But for deep de-extinction candidates, the ones people talk about most, like the woolly mammoth.
Gone for what, over 6,000 years? Saber-toothed cat, even longer, 11,000 years maybe?
Exactly. We're talking timescales that are orders of magnitude longer. Those species have been evolutionarily frozen while the rest of the world has kept changing.
And changing dramatically, especially recently. We're releasing them into the Anthropocene.
Precisely. The environment they were adapted for, say, the Pleistocene steppe, it's just gone. Today's world is shaped by human factors. Climate change, invasive species everywhere, habitats broken up.
Even for something recent, like the passenger pigeon, extinct just over 100 years ago, its ecological context, those vast eastern forests, is radically different now.
Radically different. And this huge time gap creates what the paper calls strong maladaptation. The resurrected species simply hasn't had any chance to evolve alongside these modern pressures, whether it's new climates, new competitors, or new diseases.
It's like taking a computer program from 1980 and expecting it to run perfectly on a brand new machine with a totally different operating system and network.
That's a good analogy, and it goes deeper. The paper introduces this idea of loss of eco-evolutionary experience.
How's that different from just being in the wrong habitat?
Habitat mismatch is about, say, temperature or food availability. Eco-evolutionary experience is about the interactions with other living things. The whole biological community has evolved since that species disappeared.
Ah, so the predators might hunt differently now? The diseases are new? The plants it ate might have evolved new defenses?
All of the above. Or maybe surviving species have evolved to fill the niche the extinct one left behind. So when you drop the frozen species back in,
Doesn't know the rules anymore.
it doesn't know the rules. Its immune system might be naive to modern pathogens. Its anti-predator instincts might be useless against current threats. This lack of shared evolutionary experience with the modern community dramatically increases the risk of the population just crashing again very quickly. Demographic cost, they call it.
Okay, so the local survival, both short-term and long-term, faces enormous evolutionary hurdles due to this time lag, which brings us back to the bigger picture. Macroevolution. If somehow a resurrected population does survive locally, does it actually restore meaningful evolutionary history? This is section 3, the proxy paradox.
Right, and here the paper argues that the evolutionary benefit is actually pretty limited. Maybe even non-trivial is the word they use, especially when you compare it to any potential ecological benefit.
What do you mean by ecological benefit?
Well, maybe the resurrected animal could perform some useful function in the ecosystem, like large grazers maintaining grasslands or dispersing seeds. It could act as an ecological proxy for the original species role. Think about using elephants as proxies for mammoths to manage tundra, that kind of idea.
Okay, so it might do something useful ecologically, but you're saying it fails as an evolutionary proxy. Why is that distinction so important? Why is the evolutionary loss considered irreversible?
Because what's lost in extinction, fundamentally, is history. It's that unique, unrepeatable evolutionary journey of a lineage, shaped by millions of years of specific interactions and adaptations. You can maybe replace a function. We could build a robot to graze, hypothetically, but you cannot resurrect that specific historical evolutionary path.
The copy isn't the same as the original process that created it?
Exactly. And crucially, as we discussed, the resurrected population will likely have incredibly low genetic diversity within itself. That diversity is the raw material for future evolution, for adaptation, for potentially splitting into new species down the road. A cloned population has very little of that potential. You're basically restoring a label, a taxonomic name, not a dynamic, evolving lineage.
Okay, that makes sense. Then they bring up this other issue, the phylogenetic bias and feasibility paradox. Sounds complicated.
It's actually a really clever point and kind of a major snag. We know from conservation biology that if you want to maximize the amount of evolutionary history you protect or restore, You should prioritize species that are more evolutionarily distinct.
Meaning species that have few close relatives that represent a unique branch on the tree of life, like a dodo, perhaps, versus just another subspecies of pigeon.
Precisely. Bringing back something like the dodo or maybe a thylacine, restoring a whole chunk of unique evolutionary heritage that was lost.
Yeah.
That seems like the logical target if evolutionary restoration is the goal. But the technical feasibility of de-extinction, actually getting the DNA to work, finding a surrogate mother to carry the embryo, heavily relies on having closely related living species.
Oh. So the species that are the most valuable from an evolutionary history perspective.
Are the very ones that are likely the least feasible to resurrect, because we don't have those close relatives needed for the surrogacy, or maybe even for patching up the genome sequence.
It's a paradox. The ones we can most easily bring back because they have living relatives.
Are the ones whose extinction represents the least amount of lost, unique evolutionary history, because their branch of the tree is still relatively well represented by those living relatives.
That's a fascinating and, frankly, quite a deflating point for the grander claims of de-extinction.
It really puts a damper on the idea of restoring deep evolutionary history.
And this ties directly into the resource argument, doesn't it? The paper makes a strong case that focusing on existing conservation is just better value, evolutionarily speaking.
Absolutely. The trade-off is stark, especially given how incredibly expensive deep de-extinction efforts are likely to be for a long time anyway. The paper argues, pretty convincingly, that the evolutionary benefit we get from saving the species currently threatened with extinction. They mention estimates like 1/5 of all vertebrates are at risk is vastly greater.
So the resources needed to maybe, possibly, bring back one mammoth could potentially secure the future for dozens of currently endangered species that are still evolving, still contributing to future biodiversity.
That's the argument. Protecting the living and the evolutionary potential they carry seems a far more effective strategy for conserving macroevolutionary heritage than trying to resurrect a few species from the distant past, especially given all the biological and temporal hurdles we've discussed.
Okay, let's move toward wrapping this up. Section 4 looks at the summary and the path forward based on this evolutionary framework. What's the main takeaway?
The overall conclusion is actually quite measured. It's not saying de-extinction is inherently anti-conservation or always a bad idea, but it stresses that the risks, the costs, and the evolutionary drawbacks increase dramatically the longer a species has been extinct.
So time since extinction is the critical factor.
It seems to be. And they emphasize that if we do pursue de-extinction, the assessment has to be rigorously interdisciplinary. We need strict criteria to minimize the potential evolutionary costs.
What are those costs beyond just the resurrected population failing?
Well, there are ecological risks, too. If you release a maladapted species, maybe it could unexpectedly become invasive in the modern environment, or it could spread diseases to native wildlife, or just cause unforeseen disruptions in the ecosystem. Think about unintended consequences on a large scale.
Right. So to try and manage these risks and maybe maximize any potential benefit, what criteria do they suggest for selecting the best candidates from an evolutionary perspective?
They boil it down to roughly 3 key things. First, prioritize species that went extinct relatively recently. We're talking maybe a few tens or hundreds of generations, not thousands of years. This minimizes that maladaptation gap.
Okay, recency is key.
Second, where technically possible, bearing in mind the feasibility paradox, aim for species with high evolutionary distinctiveness to get more evolutionary bang for your buck.
Maximize the unique history restored.
And third, critically, choose species whose original environment is well understood and, ideally, still exists in a recoverable state. You need to know what you're aiming for in terms of habitat restoration and release conditions.
So it sounds like the most evolutionarily defensible candidates aren't the Ice Age megafauna, but perhaps more like, say, recently extinct island birds, or maybe the Beiji River dolphin species wiped out by very specific recent human actions, where the environment might be somewhat restorable.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Much less glamorous, perhaps, but potentially more responsible from an evolutionary standpoint. They also strongly advocate for using modern tools, things like ecological niche modeling, predictive evolutionary modeling, to really rigorously assess candidates before committing resources.
Trying to predict how that frozen species might actually fare in today's changing world.
Exactly. How will it cope? What are the risks? We need to model that as best we can.
It really all loops back to that core evolutionary argument from Robert and his colleagues. Extinct species are static, frozen in time. The rest of the world isn't. It keeps evolving.
That's the fundamental mismatch. Resurrected species risk being profoundly maladapted to the present day, limiting their conservation value. We can maybe recreate the organism, but we can't instantly give it back its place in the ongoing flow of evolution.
We can make the product, but not easily recreate the dynamic process.
Well put.
So we'll leave you, our listeners, with a final thought to chew on, building on this. If technology eventually makes de-extinction much easier and cheaper, does the calculus change? Should conservation perhaps then prioritize resurrecting species that went extinct very recently, specifically due to clear human causes, like maybe the passenger pigeon or the thylacine? Could that serve as a form of, let's say, targeted short-term ecological repair for our own past actions? Or is even that still a distraction from the primary task of preventing the next extinction? Something to consider. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into de-extinction and its evolutionary paradox.